People say, it doesn't make sense. He's a billionaire, from New York no less, and everything he sits on is gold. How could he possibly connect with the common man? And yet he keeps winning more of them. Trump got trounced by black voters in 2016, so he brought in some muscle from the West Coast, someone he knows black men love, Kim Kardashian. Democrats used to own Silicon Valley, those California do-gooder liberals who wanted to save the planet. Yeah, right. Trump came along and said, regulations? We don't need no stinking regulations. Not only did he win them over, in his second inauguration, they were all sitting up on the stage with him. There was an entire section that looked like the full range of the autism spectrum. No, but elections are won on the margins by a coalition of little things that hit people personally. Trump gets this. He feels your pain in the ass. Kamala ran on democracy, which is the most important issue. But without the political skill to sell it, it added up to nothing. Meanwhile, Trump was running on, I'll make the poop go down.
People keep asking the same question as if it's some grand political mystery. How does a billionaire from New York, someone who lives like he's permanently starring in a high-budget rap video, keep connecting with everyday people? On paper, it doesn't add up. Here's a man surrounded by gold, speaking in what often sounds like a non-stop sales pitch, yet millions of voters treat him like the one politician who truly understands their daily frustrations. That's the part many in the establishment still fail to grasp. Before diving deeper, take a second to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts, because this story reveals more about modern politics than most are willing to admit. Here's the reality. Politics isn't just about polished policy papers, moral lectures, or a checklist of approved talking points. It's about connection. It's about instinct. More than anything, it's about making people feel seen, understood in what frustrates them, what worries them, and what they're tired of hearing from voices that come across as condescending or out of touch. That's where Trump has consistently held an advantage. Not because he's humble, and not because he's relatable in the traditional sense. Let's be honest, he's not exactly the average guy grilling hot dogs in the backyard. But he understands something many Democrats still struggle to accept. People don't need you to share their lifestyle. They need you to address their concerns. This is where critiques like Bill Maher's land with impact. Agree with him or not, his point is straightforward. This isn't complicated. One side adapts. The other tends to moralize. Trump lost in 2020, and instead of ignoring it, he recalibrated. He assessed where he was losing support, where he needed to adjust, and where a shift in tone or position could help. Was it always principled? Not necessarily. Trump treats consistency the way most people treat spam. He discards it when it's no longer useful. But in politics, flexibility often outperforms purity. Take younger voters as an example. During his presidency, Trump pushed to ban TikTok. Later, as youth engagement became more critical, he pivoted toward supporting it. Is that inconsistent? Absolutely. But voters often reward responsiveness more than ideological rigidity. While critics highlight contradictions, many voters simply see someone reacting to changing realities, and that carries weight. The same pattern appears with issues like cryptocurrency. At one point dismissed outright, it later became something he was willing to engage with. Again, the shift may raise eyebrows, but it reinforces a broader truth. In modern politics, adaptability can be more powerful than consistency.
Never forgets. It's only hypocrisy if you had other beliefs to begin with. In his first term, he signed an executive order banning TikTok and then got trounced by young voters. So in 24, he campaigned on saving it. And apparently every Tide Pod eater responded. Because his youth vote was up 21%. In his first term, he called cryptocurrency not money and based on thin air and said it seems like a scam. And who better to know a scam? Well, that was then. Now he's on more coins than Julius Caesar.
Again, is it elegant? Not really. Is it even fully coherent? Not always. But it signals something many political insiders miss. Trump operates more like a tabloid editor than a traditional politician. He picks up on where energy is building, where frustration is growing, and where attention is flowing, and then he jumps in. He doesn't wait for a think tank memo packed with footnotes and carefully worded disclaimers. He moves. It's messy, chaotic, and often self-serving, but it's still movement. By contrast, Democrats can sometimes come across as overly scripted, even stuck in jargon. There's an assumption that if a policy is technically better, voters will eventually come around, that the public is just one well-delivered explanation away from agreement. But voters aren't grading essays. They're reacting to what affects them every single day. Grocery bills, rent, schools, neighborhoods, commutes, and the creeping sense that everyday life is getting more expensive and more frustrating. If one side sounds like a graduate seminar while the other is talking about things people actually deal with each morning, the outcome isn't that surprising. That's why those oddly specific Trump talking points resonate. Things like shower pressure, light bulbs, or other small domestic annoyances might sound trivial to political elites. The media often dismisses them as irrelevant. But for many people, those details feel real. They reflect the accumulation of small frustrations that make daily life feel harder. And when someone speaks to that, even in a blunt or unconventional way, it can come across as recognition. Finally, someone is acknowledging the little things that seem to keep getting worse.
Could I actually make it snow more? No, but elections are won on the margins by a coalition of little things that hit people personally. Trump gets this. He feels your pain in the ass. Kamala ran on democracy, which is the most important issue. But without the political skill to sell it, it added up to nothing. Meanwhile, Trump was running on, I'll make the poop go down. He never shut up about bad shower pressure, shitty light bulbs, and low-flow toilets. Not exactly ask not what your country can do for you, but for some little niche group, it was all that mattered. He's right. It shouldn't take 2 flushes to make my shit go away. That's my guy, YMCA.
That's the point. Elections are often decided on the margins, and those margins are built from small, personal frustrations. The kinds of everyday annoyances political professionals tend to overlook until they suddenly matter a lot more than expected. And that ties into one of the biggest mistakes Democrats have made over the past decade: confusing moral conviction with political effectiveness. Kamala Harris and many others have leaned heavily on themes like democracy, norms, institutions, and the broader moral stakes of the moment. To be fair, those things do matter a great deal. But having the right issue isn't the same as communicating it in a way that resonates. People are worried about paying bills, public disorder, or whether their city feels less safe than it did 5 years ago. Abstract appeals to democratic values can feel distant. They don't always connect. Unless those larger ideas are tied directly to everyday experiences, simply telling voters something is important isn't enough. You have to make them feel why it matters in their own lives.
You can give the people all the goodies Joe Manchin will allow, and it doesn't seem to buy their love. Why? Why is the party that supports so many issues that benefit the middle class still considered out of touch by 62% of Americans? In plain English, nobody likes a snob.
Republicans, for better or worse, have often been more effective at translating ideas into messages that land. They compress, simplify, and repeat, turning complex concerns into blunt, memorable lines. Democrats, by contrast, can sometimes sound overly academic, as if they're moderating a panel on reimagining equitable sustainability, rather than speaking to everyday concerns. And then there's confusion about why people tune out, because most voters don't want to feel lectured or talked down to. They want to feel heard and understood. This dynamic feeds into how the woke label became politically toxic. Not because every critique of social justice is valid, and not because every progressive idea lacks merit, but because the overall presentation started to alienate people. Over time, Democrats became associated with a style of communication that felt scolding, overly online, and disconnected from normal conversation. Issues began to feel like tests of language and identity rather than discussions. Disagreements were sometimes framed as moral failings. Institutions were broadly criticized, traditions questioned, humor scrutinized, and criticism itself often treated as harm. For many people, it became exhausting, not necessarily because they engaged with every argument in detail, but because the tone itself felt overwhelming. That sense of exhaustion created a political opening, and Trump stepped into it.
Hi, Christmas Eve voter. Look, you obviously don't like Trump, or you'd be in that camp already, but you're still torn. And I'm the guy who keeps saying, I get why. You wanted more reassurance that the Democrat isn't going to go along with every aggressively anti-common sense idea that comes out of the woke mind virus, which, yes, is a thing. And if she loses, that will be mainly why.
Even more interesting is that he didn't rely solely on traditional Republican instincts. He started building unusual, sometimes unlikely coalitions. And that's a part of the story many people underestimate. For a long time, Democrats assumed they had a permanent hold on celebrity culture, youth culture, tech culture, and the broader internet space. That was supposed to be their domain. But gradually, some high-profile figures in business and entertainment began to drift, or at least stopped aligning as predictably. Why? In part because the progressive coalition became more rigid. When a political movement places heavy emphasis on ideological consistency, even those who once felt comfortable within it can start to feel constrained. Over time, some allies grow frustrated with the expectation to constantly adapt to shifting norms or language, especially when those expectations feel unclear or constantly evolving. What followed was a shift. Trump and others on the right didn't necessarily become more culturally polished, but they positioned themselves as more open to people who felt out of step with that rigidity. That created opportunities to expand their reach in places that weren't traditionally strongholds. For example, there were efforts to make gains among black voters, particularly black men, where even small shifts can matter in closely contested cities and swing states. It's important to keep that in perspective. These weren't sweeping majorities, but in politics, outcomes often hinge on margins. You don't always need to win every group outright. Sometimes it's about narrowing the gap just enough in key places to change the overall result.
Not exactly ask not what your country can do for you, but for some little niche group, it was all that mattered. He's right. It shouldn't take 2 flushes to make my shit go away. That's my guy, YMCA. People say, it doesn't make sense. He's a billionaire, from New York no less. And everything he sits on is gold. How could he possibly connect with the common man? And yet he keeps winning more of them. Trump got trounced by black voters in 2016, so he brought in some muscle from the West Coast, someone he knows black men love, Kim Kardashian.
That's where symbolic relationships, celebrity endorsements, and visible outreach start to matter. A candidate doesn't need unanimous approval, just enough cultural permission for some voters to take a second look. Sometimes that small shift is all it takes to move the needle. This is another area where Democrats often struggle. Coalition building can come across as an exercise in perfection, where everyone is expected to be fully aligned, sufficiently informed, and ideologically consistent. But politics doesn't work like that. It's not a purity test, it's a coalition business. Successful coalitions are messy by nature. They include people who are imperfect, inconsistent, influential, unconventional. People who don't speak in polished, academic language but can connect with audiences that more traditional voices simply can't reach. Republicans have generally been more comfortable with that reality. Democrats, at times, seem uneasy with it, as if the lack of uniformity itself is a problem. But in practice, that messiness is often what makes a coalition effective.
Together they passed the First Step Act, which scaled back restrictions on felons, a connection he built on in 2024 by becoming one. And then he pardoned Lil Wayne, and pardoned Kodak Black, and the CEO of Jay-Z's company, and the founder of Death Row Records, and the former mayor of Detroit. So it's not surprising that Kanye, and Wayne, and Chris Brown, and Amber Rose, and Snoop, and DaBaby all talked him up. That last one out of professional courtesy.
Then there's Silicon Valley, which might be the most telling shift of all. For years, the tech world embraced a kind of progressive branding, talking about saving the planet, reducing inequality, building community, and changing the world. That identity fit neatly with the broader cultural moment. But as the political climate evolved, becoming more focused on regulation, content moderation, and ideological boundaries, parts of that same world began to drift. Not necessarily toward traditional conservatism, but toward whichever side seemed less restrictive or less inclined to scrutinize them. It's not especially complicated. People with wealth, influence, and platforms generally resist environments where they feel constrained or consistently criticized, especially by the same circles they're often expected to support. When that tension builds, even long-standing alignments can start to loosen.
Democrats used to own Silicon Valley. Those California do-gooder liberals who wanted to save the planet. Yeah, right. Trump came along and said, regulations? We don't need no stinking regulations. Not only did he win them over, in his second inauguration, they were all sitting up on the stage with him. There was an entire section that looked like the full range of the autism spectrum.
Now consider another major challenge. Critics like Bill Maher often point to a gap between ideas that resonate in activist spaces and how those same ideas are received in everyday American life. That gap becomes especially visible around anything labeled socialism. Most Americans aren't rejecting reform. They want fairness, opportunity, better wages, affordable housing, good schools, safe communities, and a healthcare system that feels accessible, not exploitative. But that doesn't automatically translate into support for rhetoric that sounds hostile to markets, private property, or the basic aspirations of the middle class. Take homeownership. For many people, it isn't a symbol of inequality, it's a goal. It represents stability, security, and progress. It's what previous generations worked toward and what many still hope to achieve. When political messaging seems dismissive of that aspiration, it can feel out of touch with how people actually see their lives and ambitions. The broader lesson is about alignment. Policies may aim to address real problems, but if the framing clashes with widely held values, especially around stability and upward mobility, it becomes much harder to build support.
Very key appointment in the most important city in the country, which is also our financial center. It matters that the mayor stands by, and so I assume stands with, someone who says things like, if you don't believe in the government's sacred right to seize private property, it's over. Seize private property. Home ownership is racist. Elect more communists.
And that points to a deeper issue. Democrats sometimes get pulled toward language and priorities that resonate strongly in elite or activist circles, but don't always translate well to everyday concerns. The average voter isn't debating the fundamentals of capitalism. They're thinking about whether their paycheck covers expenses, whether their kids are learning useful skills, and whether their communities feel stable and well managed. When political messaging becomes too abstract or overly filtered through ideological framing, it can create distance. People tend to respond to what feels immediate and tangible in their lives. If that connection isn't made, even well-intentioned ideas can miss the mark. That gap, between activist-driven conversations and day-to-day realities, is often where support starts to slip. And what can make it more challenging is how losses are interpreted. When setbacks are attributed mainly to misinformation or voter misunderstanding, it can prevent a closer look at whether the message itself connected effectively, or whether priorities felt aligned with what most people are experiencing. And in politics, that kind of misreading can be costly. Adjusting messaging, broadening appeal, and staying grounded in widely shared concerns are often what determine whether a campaign gains traction or loses it.
Seize private property. Home ownership is racist. Elect more communists. Private property, especially home ownership, is a weapon of white supremacy. Really? Even among the 20 million black Americans who own their own home? I mean, these are the kind of utterances I might forgive as something a dumb white girl said while she was at Bryn Mawr. Because it's the kind of privilege hating you can only learn for $95,000 a year. But these are statements made as an adult. Yes, for co-eds from elite private colleges, you're only a lesbian until graduation, but the communism lasts a lifetime.
Trump, for all his flaws, isn't under the illusion that vibes don't matter. He grasps that politics is emotional theater built on everyday frustrations. When people feel dismissed, mocked, or talked down to by elite institutions, he sees an opening, and he exploits it relentlessly. That doesn't mean he's right about everything, or that every criticism he makes is fair, or that every alliance or pivot is admirable. It means he understands the battlefield better than a party that keeps repeating the same mistakes. Here's the key takeaway. It's not about portraying Trump as a flawless strategist, nor about ignoring ideology, nor underestimating voters. It's about recognizing that persuasion beats smugness, practicality beats posturing, and coalition building beats purity tests. If a party makes people feel like they need a permission slip to express normal concerns, don't be surprised when they gravitate towards someone who says, "I get why you're frustrated." At the end of the day, most people aren't looking for a revolution. They want a decent life, competence, affordability, security, and a sense that their country feels stable again. The party that speaks most clearly to those instincts wins, even if the messengers are messy, the delivery is rough, and the experts keep insisting it shouldn't work.
Now, did he win the black vote? Not even close. But he doubled what he got in 2020, and in places like Philly, Detroit, and Milwaukee, that was the difference. And now he's going to do it with pot. Finally, he got around.
And that's why this pattern keeps repeating. It's not because Americans suddenly forgot who Trump is, or because voters are oblivious. It's because one side communicates as if politics is about managing real life, while the other often treats it like a graduate thesis wrapped in guilt and moral posturing. One side adjusts after taking a hit. The other writes an op-ed explaining why the hit shouldn't have mattered. That's simply not a winning formula. Until Democrats recognize that gap and start speaking to people's everyday realities rather than just their ideals, they'll keep learning the same lesson the hard way.